Talking Cov Cono this edition looks into sport journalism and the changes this profession is making. We hear from the Telegraphs Jim White, along with one of the country's most recognised football writers, Henry Winter, who I get the chance to interview and ask whether he can report fairly and accurately on Steven Gerrard, the man who he ghostwrites his autobiography. The Daily and Sunday Mirror's Alan Nixon also tells what it's like on the red top side of reporting and how he gets tipped off for transfer gossip. Sport reporting is now serious business these days. There is more and more sport coverage on television and especially in the newspapers. Sport sells newspapers, and often readers will turn straight to the back pages of newspapers, whilst others buy a paper purely for the sport news. The ever-increasing sports supplements provided by newspapers are supply and demand for people's increasing thirst for every last bit of detail on their heroes. Quality newspapers have realised this and follow their red tops in having a huge sports section. The Times Game supplement provides 24 pages of football coverage on a Monday, while the Telegraph has a 24-page daily football supplement. Martin Samuel recently left the Times to join the Daily Mail for a staggering £400,000 a year. With this, there must come a worry that the egos of sport writers become so big that their views become so one-sided and blinded that these can affect and pile pressure on the governing bodies, such as the FA, who are forced to do what the press tells them, as other parts of the media and fans alike jump along this bandwagon. These campaigns, which newspapers start, have even been known to force England managers to pick certain players. Former England manager Steve McClaren decided to drop David Beckham from his squad after the press questioned whether he was deserving of a place in his side, only for this move to be criticised by the press after a few poor England performances. McClaren soon brought him back into his squad after it seemed Beckham's England career was over. While writer, broadcaster and sports columnist for the Telegraph, Jim White, believes some members of the press believe he is so powerful they can influence even more important decisions.
A good example of that is there's a lot of, or several, football writers who are convinced that they have the power to remove an England manager from his position. I don't think that's true, and certainly you would say that the current England manager has nothing but contempt for the press and has demonstrated that the England manager need not worry about him at all. But I think egos have grown exponentially with the amount of money that's available. But you have to remember it's only at the very, very top of the game.
Alan Nixon is the Daily and Sunday Mirror's transfer specialist. He's not a fan of how newspapers cash in on their top writers to sell a newspaper.
It's almost seen as a trophy. You know, if you get a top columnist or something like that. But let's be specific. Martin Samuel at the Daily Mail is on a great deal of money because the Daily Mail are the type of paper that like to throw money around. But they're not buying him for his stories. They're buying him for his name and for his writing. I mean, that's okay. That's not exactly my field, but that's okay. If you think somebody's going to sell newspapers, I'm a bit more old-fashioned. I like to think that football news stories should sell newspapers, but unfortunately I might be getting in a minority with that.
The Telegraph's Henry Winter is one of the top football writers of his generation, but does he ever look down on red top reporters?
No chance, absolutely. God, no, they probably look down on us. Okay. No, some of my best mates work at the red top. That feudal element of Fleet Street is gone. There's a lot of fluidity. The guy I just mentioned, Ollie Holt, was an outstanding football correspondent at the time, and now he's a chief sports writer at the Daily Mirror, which a lot of people would say is a big jump. But no, I think the best writings, like people like Steve Howard and Sean Custis at the Sun, Ollie Holt, Martin Nixon at the Mirror, Brian Woolnough at the Star, that sort of, the pieces that they write, you can stick in the Telegraph, absolutely no problem. I would say, if anything, they're probably harder working than us. I always laugh at my mate at the Sun, because I reckon he could come and work at the Telegraph. Whether I could go and work at the Sun with the same success, I'm not so sure.
However, is there a worry that with this constant demand for news, especially in the world of football, that journalists start to simply make stories up to appease the audience and maybe more importantly, their editors, to make sure they are always ahead of their newspaper rivals? Jim White believes this can be the case, especially for those journalists working on behalf of the Red Tops.
It's more obvious if you work in tabloid newspapers, where there's a constant need for the headline on the back page in the sports section that's going to provoke sales. And if you spoke to a tabloid sports reporter, they would be under a great obligation to come up with stories. The irony is, of course, that a lot of them work together at events, so that you could go along to an event where all the reporters are working together as a pack, and largely what they're doing is protecting each other's back, so that they come up with a story together, which then appears in all the papers the next day. What they don't want is someone breaking ranks, because what happens then is they get a bollocking from their editor for not coming up with the story themselves. So there's a very strange kind of working relationship where you're working in collusion, but at the same time trying to get one over on your rival.
Has Winter ever felt the pressure from his bosses to report a story that he knows not to be true?
Never, and that's why I work for the Telegraph. I mean, there was a real time. It was very difficult for football correspondent at the times when Rupert Murdoch was trying to buy Manchester United in the mid-90s. Yeah. I mean, that would have just been a disaster, because how could you have had any objectivity? I mean, the great thing about the Telegraph, and I've worked at the Telegraph and the Independent, and I've never, ever, ever had 1 ounce of pressure placed on me to sort of go easy on someone, to go off someone. I mean, I had an issue when I was criticising the board at Newcastle United, and Northern Rock was sort of unhappy about, because they're Newcastle sponsors, were unhappy about it, and obviously they're big advertisers for us. But no one ever in the building would ever say, listen, mate, go easy on the owners of Newcastle United, because their sponsors Northern Rock.
Red Top newspapers have picked up the reputation of exaggerating stories and even coming up with tales which seem almost ridiculous. So is there pressure on Nixon to jazz up stories?
Not really, no. I think any time you get a story, you try and make it as interesting as possible for people. But you've also got to balance that with the fact that, it's got to be something that people can believe and will come back again for. I don't think people actually make things up. A lot of people maybe stretch it a little bit. But you've also got to bear in mind that newspapers still break stories as much, if not more, than any form of media. If you do a story about something that's going to happen, you think in a week or two, and it falls down, then you can look stupid at times. But the nature of the business is that you are trying to get the story before it breaks. So you've just got to try and be as careful as possible. You weigh up the likelihood of all the factors involved, that the tip you've got is actually going to come into reality.